In the previous videos, we've been adding items at edit time rather than adding them at runtime. By adding items at runtime, you're able to add a whole bunch of different items by basically just creating a new prefab of that item, and it makes it really easy to add this new item. This is actually the method that's used by our standalone inventory asset with the character controller integration. All the items are added at runtime. And you'll kind of see this more with RPGs rather than something like a first-person shooter. But it's a great feature to have, so let's go ahead and go through for how to add items at runtime. I'm assuming with this video that you've seen the previous videos on setting up a first and third person item. That video or those videos go in depth into how to set up an item, and you'll want to make sure you watch those first, as I'm not going to go into that same depth at all for all the fields within the item manager. So let's get started by opening up the item manager. And for this, the name of this item that we want to create, we'll call it Runtime Sword, because it will be a sword that can be picked up at runtime. I know I'm really creative. All right, so now let's go ahead and add the item type, and we will use the same item type that we used within the melee weapon video. And for character, we're going to leave this blank. And we want to leave it blank because we are using a runtime item and we aren't necessarily assigning it to a specific character. So because this character field's blank, we need to assign the slot ID. The slot ID is the location that the runtime item should be added to, and we can find that ID by drilling down to the character's hands and seeing what ID is assigned for that item slot. So we can see that there's this items game object, and there's an item slot component that has an ID of 1 for the character's left hand, and for the character's right hand, it has an ID of 0. Now for first person arms, depending on if you've already configured an item for it, you may not actually have this component, this item slot component for each hand, and that's no problem. If you don't happen to have it, then you can just go ahead and create a new child game object. The name doesn't matter, but I prefer to name it items, and then you'll want to add the item slot component. And this ID should be a unique value. And so 1 is a unique value for the first person arms because it represents the left hand. This value should match the same thing on the third person perspective if you're using a third person character. So getting back to our runtime sword, we have a slot ID of 0, so that looks good because we want it to appear in the right hand. The animator ID, we should use a value of 22 because that's the value that our animator uses in the demo scene. We now can go to this first person visible item. We are not adding a base object because we want to use this base object right here. And so we're just leaving that empty because we want this sword to spawn as a child of these Nolan first person arms. So the visible item, we want to assign the sword model to that visible item. So I'm just going to drag that model in. And the model does not have an animator controller, so I'll leave that blank. And I'm going to do something similar for third person. So now the last thing that we need to do is assign the action type, and the action type should be melee weapon. So now when we hit build, instead of the item being added to the character, it's going to be saved as a prefab. So now I'm just going to hit save, and we can see it right here. The last thing that we need to do is we need to figure out a way to actually pick up the item. And so now that the item is created, we need to figure out a way to actually have the character pick up the item because the character doesn't actually know that this sword exists. And we can do that by creating a new item pickup under the object manager. I'll call this Runtime Sword Pickup. And then the game object that we want to use is the sword model. So that's that same model that we used previously. And let me grab that in. And now we will hit build object. And we can close this because we're done with that. So let's just drag this prefab in, and we'll put it a little bit in front of the character. So now when we start playing, let's see what happens. Actually, okay, so nothing happens. The reason for that is because this sword pickup doesn't know about that sword runtime item. We can fix that by specifying first a pickup set. This specifies the items that should be picked up when this item is picked up, and we want to drag the runtime sword in. You'll notice that the slot is automatically filled in because it detects which sword or which item was assigned to it, and then it will automatically fill in the slots, so all that looks good. Then under item definition amounts, we want to add the my sword item type, because that just allows the inventory or the item pickup to know that it should actually pick up this sword. If I were to not have this item definition amount at all, and I just had this pickup set, then the character would just add the sword to his hierarchy, but he wouldn't actually pick it up within the inventory. Because we want to actually pick it up as well within the inventory, that's why we're specifying this item definition amount. So now when I hit play, we should get a different result. And if I walk to it, you can see that I do have the sword. It's hard to see in the game view, but you can clearly see it in the scene view. If I switch to third person, you can see that I have the sword as well. So that's it in terms of the kind of runtime portion. We now need to position the sword. And actually, let me hit play again. This positioning should be very familiar to you from the other videos, in that you have to position this visible item into a specific location based on this gizmo. And instead of spending the time trying to figure out the values that work for that, I already have a good set of values, so I'm just going to paste that in. The trick now with runtime item is, because this object is spawned dynamically, as soon as I end Unity, it's going to forget about these values. So what I want to do now is lock this inspector so that I can remember these values, and then I'm going to open up the prefab for this runtime sword. And I'm going to do that within a new inspector tab. And so now let me open up that prefab. And this is all the properties related to that item. And if I scroll down to the first person perspective item, this local spawn position and rotation, these are the values that I want to change for that visible item. So let me just copy and paste. And when I get done with this, I'm going to need to do the same thing for third person. And third person happens to use the exact same values, so that makes that aspect easy. So if I just copy and paste these values one more time, then when I end Unity and I spawn the character again, or I spawn the item again, they should be in the correct location. So let me get out of being in lock mode there, and I can just go ahead and close this. Now when I hit play, the values should have persisted and it should be appearing in the correct location. So that does look a lot better. There are some properties that obviously need to be adjusted, such as the location that this sword equips and unequips at, because it's kind of just disappearing and appearing. But now the rest of the process is exactly the same as the other videos, and you'll just want to make all of your edits within this runtime sword prefab instead of on the item game object, because notice there are no items underneath that game object until I actually pick up the item and actually add it. So now this runtime sword was added. The last thing that I want to note is, for the first person perspective, you'll notice that it had spawned underneath the first person arms that I have in the scene. And the reason why it did that, first let me go back to this. The item is spawning underneath these arms, so this Nolan first person arms. And if you have multiple sets of arms, you can specify which arms it spawns under by this first person base object ID. You notice it has a value of 0. This 0 value corresponds to this base object ID value right here. So that's how it knew to spawn underneath those arms. So that's all there is to it, to runtime pickups.